Hi, my name's Patricia Worby and I'm here today with my colleague Dr. Rainer Viehweger, and we're going to be talking about heat shock proteins. Now, I became aware of these only recently when researching my book, which came out last year, and I didn't realize how important they are to cellular function. And I thought it might be a really good opportunity to discuss them in the light of what's happening currently with coronavirus and immune function generally. So lovely to speak with you, Rainer. And my first question, I think we need to just discuss first of all, what are heat shock proteins?
Yes, that's an interesting question. We all know that proteins are the engines of life. So they make up all our tissues, and they are those molecules in our organism that make us moving, so that they are just very often changing their shape, and they also have to be in the right shape. So when we look at muscles, everything that is contracting or distracting is done by several proteins, and also the structures of our connective tissues and many cell structures are proteins. And we also know that when we cook an egg, for example, the proteins, which is the white of the egg, which is liquid, and then we heat it up, and then it changes its consistence. And we all know that we say it becomes denatured. So when we go back to the structure of a protein, then we all know there is a gene that codes for a protein in the DNA, and the DNA is read, and there is a messenger RNA made from it, which has all the codons for the sequence in which the amino acids build the peptides, which are the smaller building blocks of bigger proteins.
Yeah.
And what happens in the cell at the ribosomes is that these amino acids are formed into let's say, a single very long chain. And then there are certain procedures that happen with the long chain of amino acids, which is already the protein, but then to work, it has to fold. And there are different ways of how such a protein can fold. So there's a secondary structure. The amino sequence is the primary. And the secondary structure is something where it just turns a little bit and creates a helix, so a kind of a spiral-like structure. And the other one is called the beta sheet, where it just gets folded and stacks onto each other. But then there's the tertiary structure as well, and this is another spatial structure which creates the let's say the wheel shape of the protein. And when this structure becomes disturbed or destroyed, we talk about denaturation, and the protein would not be able to function anymore.
Yeah, so if the 3D shape is affected in any way, it changes its function.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Proteins can only function when they are in the right 3D shape.
Yeah, we tend to forget that, don't we? Because we look at structures as a linear sequence and think that in the cells that they have this nice long chain. We don't, up till recently, we haven't really known about the 3D conformation of things. Yeah. Or how they move, actually, because they're not just static, are they? They're vibrating as well, aren't they?
They're vibrating. They are reacting to changes in the environmental charge when they are close to other charged molecules, or even to changes in a pH of water.
Right.
And we all know, put a protein into water, it will be solved, but put it into alcohol, it just becomes denatured. It will change its shape, it will become very rigid. And this shape cannot go back into the natural state anymore.
No. Well, you can't do that with egg whites, so that's the same thing, isn't it?
And then all the cells during evolution, they are in an environment which is not always friendly. And it was discovered in 1960 by an Italian researcher who saw that when he warmed up cells, and this is why they were called heat shock proteins at the end, it was thought that the cell would stop protein production when it is too warm. And we all know that when we have too high fever, that goes above 42 degrees Celsius, our proteins would denaturate and we would die. So, and he expected that no protein would be formed, but instead he could see an activity on the DNA, and there were some classes of very smaller proteins were formed, which they did not expect, and they didn't know what they are for. And later they were called heat shock proteins, and in the 70s, the reaction was called heat shock reaction. So we have now HSP for the proteins and HSR for the reaction. And it's a very important protective procedure which cells can perform to protect themselves from being damaged too much. And it's not only heat that can do it, it can also happen through an injury. It can happen in a response to toxins, especially also in response to heavy metal toxicity, for example. It is also happening in response to a very high sympathetic tone. So when we are in constant stress, we will activate a heat shock response to protect ourselves. And it is also induced by physical exercise. And that's also something that signals the brain to stop exercising because the damage to the muscle tissue may be too high. And we should try and repair. So this is all. These are all important things, and we can, for example, learn from that as well. That it's not good to have an extended kind of myofascial deep massage without giving the body 1 or 2 or 3 days of rest to work on the changes that were initiated.
Right, so the repair.
Because we may just overwhelm the function of cells. And then infections would cause a heat shock response. Yes. And that may be viral infection, that may be bacterial infection. And another important thing is that it was seen that in people who have complications from a coronavirus infection, for example, that those people very often had high blood pressure. They very often had diabetes type 2, and they very often had cardiovascular diseases. And these 3 things together are called also metabolic syndrome. And what we need to know about it, that in the background, on a cellular level, there is something going on that we call silent inflammation. Which consumes a lot of energy, which changes how the body reacts to certain signals. And the receptors do not work, so that's why we have glucose intolerance, for example. And it was interesting that it was found, and I could read this in a recent article that came from Brazil, from researchers from Brazil, that when there is a chronic silent inflammation present in someone's body, due to toxicity, due to stress, due to bad diet and so forth, then the ability of the cells to run a heat shock response in response to all kind of stress is depleted.
Oh.
So those people cannot initiate the heat shock response in the right way anymore. And this is a very, very interesting phenomenon, which may explain why those people have problems with those infections. Because what are those heat shock proteins doing? Well, we didn't talk about what they do. Because everything that happens to our cells is that the shape, the 3D spatial structure of our cell proteins is altered. So it may happen that certain proteins become denatured and they don't work anymore. And this involves enzymes, it involves receptors on the cell surface, and it may also involve some structural proteins inside the cells, and also many regulatory proteins, which regulate metabolism, which regulate how the DNA is read, which regulate gene expression. So there's a lot of things that proteins do in a cell, and the heat shock proteins is a group of proteins which supports the cell in making sure that there are no misfolded proteins in the cell. And it's done in two ways. Once, the heat shock proteins make sure that when the proteins are made, there is no mistake.
Okay, yeah.
Sometimes proteins have to be transported through membranes. Let's say from the cytosol inside the cell into a mitochondria.
Yeah.
It has to cross the mitochondrial membrane, and it cannot go through in the folded 3D configuration. So they have to defold, then go through the membrane, and then to refold. And this is also supported and controlled and regulated by heat shock proteins, for example.
That's why they're called chaperones, I guess. That's another name.
Yeah, they protect the proteins. That's why they're also called chaperones. And on the other hand, when there is a protein damage, which can be certain aggregates, denatured structures, the heat shock proteins help to repair those. And if it's not possible because the damage is too big, they also support the cell in breaking those proteins down.
Right.
And this is called proteolysis. And so they have a lot of work to do in our cells. During normal cell life, but the amount will be increased when there is a signal, a threat from outside, which puts the cell into stress.
You mentioned viral infection as one of those stresses, and obviously
that's one of those. Yeah,
we're in that's relevant to now, I think, where we're seeing a lot of people being admitted to hospital probably 10 days or so after they're first infected. So there's obviously a lag period where the immune system is trying to deal with the virus but not doing it very effectively, possibly because they have silent inflammation going on. And then things start to get very hypoxic, don't they? I mean, that's when people go into hospital because they are not getting enough oxygen in their blood. And so what's going on there, do you think?
Heat shock proteins are also presented on blood cells, on the white blood cells. And what they do there is they are part of what is called the antigen, how should I say that? What's the right word? The antigen presenting complex, so the APC. And this is the area on which the immune cell will recognize, for example, an infected cell or even a tumor cell.
Oh, yes.
And it will transmit signals and information to other macrophages, which eat those cells up at the end and destroy those cells. And on the other hand, heat shock proteins activate the macrophages and they activate the lymphocytes.
Right. So they're
So
working.
this is another important function. And
Yeah.
of course, there are different classes of heat shock proteins which are distinguished by their relative molecular weight. There are classes that go from HSP10 for 10,000 Dalton, which is a molecular weight, or it goes up to HSP 110. And there are some groups like 40, 70, 60, and 90, which are extensively researched because you can use them for all kinds of purposes, for identification of toxins, for identification of tumor cells, for the identification of infections even. And you know, the modern treatment may be a tumor vaccine.
Yeah, I've
where
heard
you put a substrate of a tumor cell into a vaccine, and you would also put some heat shock proteins to the vaccine, which would activate the immune system against the tumor in the patient.
Yeah, because as I understand it, cancer cells are very clever at evading the immune system, aren't they?
Oh
They have
yeah,
their,
and that's also related to heat shock proteins.
yeah, I knew it would be.
Yes, this is a very interesting thing because heat shock proteins are the chaperones, but not only for the normal cell, also for the cancer cell. And we all know that a tumor cell lives in a very toxic environment. That's why the cell changes and becomes a tumor cell because it only wants to survive. And then it produces a huge amount of heat shock proteins to protect itself. We all know that there is a reaction that is called apoptosis, where the cell becomes suicidal when the damage is too big, and heat shock proteins prevent the tumor cell from doing that. So they actually help the tumor cell survive.
Right, which isn't what we
which isn't what we want. But here we see how complex biology is, because the tumor cell makes a lot of heat shock proteins to protect itself inside the cell. But what it doesn't do is it does not release heat shock proteins to the cell surface. So it will not present an antigen on the cell surface to tell the immune system, here I am, I'm a tumor cell, come and kill me. So the cell doesn't do that.
No.
The tumor cell. And here is something that could be done, and this is also done with the tumor vaccine. So that's the idea behind it. If you would have heat shock proteins outside the cell, for example, when you eat it, and there is now a supplement that contains heat shock proteins, and it's probably possible to try that. Maybe it helps a little bit. If you would have heat shock proteins in your bloodstream and in your from absorption, and you would have it in the extracellular space, it would activate the immune system against the tumor cells, but also against infected cells when you have a virus, or against bacteria, wherever needs to be done.
So
and what it also does, it will reduce or make the tumor cell not producing so many heat shock proteins inside. And it will also force the cell to release heat shock proteins into the surface. So on different levels, it will support the tumor cell in being detected by the immune system.
Exactly.
And being destroyed. So it's very complicated, but it's so interesting.
I was wondering whether you mentioned that there are different types of heat shock proteins, the different weights, and we consider those families, different families of heat shock
Yeah,
proteins.
the classes, yeah.
Yeah. So whether the ones that present on the outside are different to the ones that maybe the cancer cell or the viral cell uses inside to evade detection.
It's even more complicated. It even can be the same.
Can it?
And
Okay.
some of those classes, they work together. They support each other.
Okay. Right. So
there's a 60 years body of research behind it, and it becomes more and more complicated. The regulation of how the cells work is so complicated.
I know that there was when I was doing my research, there was quite a body of work about the contraindications for cancer, because obviously you don't want to promote the tumor cell to survive. Mm-hmm. So, well, at least not in the conventional view of how we look at, dealing with cancer. And that's, quite apart from dealing with the toxic milieu that the cells are adapted to, which is how a natural medicine approach looks at it. You've got to deal with the environment first, not just kill the cell.
Yeah, but that's an interesting thing, because I said the tumor cell itself will produce the heat shock proteins inside itself to protect itself, and not release it outside the cell. But when you have more heat shock proteins outside the cell, the immune system is much more active.
Yeah.
And it would help the organism
as a whole
to deal with the situation, to recognize the tumor cells, and then to deal with it.
Yeah. So this is an interesting new approach to dealing with cancer.
Yes.
Which is yet to be developed, I think, but I know that many groups are working on this. What about the relevance then to general immunity? What we're seeing, you talked about the chronic silent inflammation, and because there are a lot of people getting ill who don't actually have coexisting conditions, or not diagnosed coexisting conditions. So we know that a lot of diabetics and people with heart disease and so on are being, admitted to hospital. But what about those people with nothing diagnosed? What would you say is happening there?
We go through an infection. So when there is that threat from the outside, or even internally in the body, when we have some mental or emotional stress.
Yeah, like you said. Yeah.
What happens is that there is the signal for the cells to produce the heat shock proteins to protect the 3D structure for protein function inside the cell. What also happens is that an inflammation is initiated, because we all know that an inflammation is a process that is always starting when some damage has happened, and it's more or less created by nature to repair tissue, to repair cells, to clean it up. We set it on fire, we just burn it, and then when it's done, it's clear again. It's like the rainforest sometimes. So nature does the same thing. And the problem is always happening when this is not stopped again.
Yeah.
So when you have a chronic toxicity, when you have chronic stress, when you have that kind of chronic damage,
Yeah.
the inflammation that is initiated is never stopped again.
Yeah.
And in this process, to stop the inflammation, you have to do basically two things. You have to look for the cause. So what is the toxic substance, or what is the toxic environment that creates that situation?
Yep. Or
And
toxic.
the other one is support the cell in ending that inflammation. And I'm aware of two approaches that could be used for that.
Mm-hmm.
One is the latest application of heat shock proteins, and the other one is using omega-3 fatty acids.
Okay. Yeah.
These are the two things which are very important to finish such a process like an inflammation. But of course, that would only work completely when the initiating factor has gone.
Yes. Yes. You've got to deal with that first. And
Yeah.
a lot of the people I'm noticing who are getting ill, who say, you know, I didn't have any existing condition, are actually high stress people.
Mm-hmm.
They're either, I mean, there's been several accounts of people who said, you know, I'm a fit person, I go running every day, you know,
Yeah.
and I wonder whether they're actually not repairing well, like they're overexerting themselves
Right.
without the right
Yes.
amount of.
Yeah, there are certain situations in which you can damage yourself. One is really overtraining.
Mm-hmm.
That would injure too many cells, and you would probably not be able to repair it in time.
Yeah.
So we always need the balance
Yeah.
of what we can do. And this may be also a reason why really high-level athletes are in danger of being infected with viruses very easily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because their immune system is always altered in a way that it does not function the right way as it should. So
Yeah.
when the sympathetic tone is too high and the immune system goes down, that's one thing. Another way of how stress could damage your heat shock reaction and cause cardiovascular problems is that when we produce a lot of cortisol due to stress, then the production of our sexual hormones goes down.
Yeah.
And it's not only women who have a high level of estrogen, but also men have some estrogen.
Mm-hmm.
And estrogen is known to protect the heart.
Absolutely, which is why men tend to get more heart disease. Yeah.
And this is also, and estrogen, what's estrogen doing? It is inducing a heat shock reaction.
Oh, right. Uh-huh.
Yes, and the heat shock reaction would produce heat shock proteins which repair your proteins in your heart muscle.
Right. That's why you often see peak runners and so on collapsing at the end of the marathon or something.
Yeah.
They just, yeah, haven't been able to repair. Yeah.
So it may be for many people in certain situations just consuming a little bit of heat shock proteins when they are now available, to protect themselves and to make themselves a little bit stronger.
Yeah. So they're available now as a supplement. You said that.
Yeah.
As a, I believe it's in a lysosome or something. It's a oil droplet, isn't it? To enable it to get through the stomach, because otherwise it would be digested. To get into the
you would like to prevent the proteins from being denaturated, so they still should work and keep their 3D structure.
Yeah, so they're available to take to actually add to the body as a signaling molecule, because we talked about that. They're signaling molecules as well as
as a yes, It's just signaling many functions related to the immune system, but also to the cells to repair themselves. And what I tried them, and what I feel, and many people feel, that you know, when this silent inflammation is going on in the body, we could say the first organ that is affected is always the liver.
Yeah.
And the liver protects many other organs. So the liver cleans the blood. It protects the heart by cleaning the blood.
Yes.
So it reduces everything that would cause oxidation. It produces cholesterol a lot.
That's right.
Which is an antioxidant.
Yes.
Which prevents us from rusting.
Yes.
But when it gets into damaged arteries, it builds up plaque, which is together with calcium, which is not good. So we have to reduce the inflammation, and then it can go again. So the first organ is the liver. Then the next organ that could be damaged is the heart. And we had all those heart diseases during the last few decades, and it's still the most that cause of death which kills most people, cardiovascular disease.
Yes. And brain inflammation, I imagine, as well.
And then what I could read when I was reading about omega-3s, which is also related a lot to silent inflammation, that when the next step, when we are under stress and live in a toxic environment, the next step is that the liver is not able to not only not protect the heart anymore, but not protect the brain. And we create inflammation in the brain. And then we have all these neurodegenerative diseases. We develop Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, depression, and all these diseases, which are pretty much related to being the brain under fire.
Yeah, I would say even before that, you've got cognitive difficulties, insomnia.
Right. Oh, yes. All these things, and the end result is then called myalgic encephalopathy, or ME, or chronic fatigue, or fibromyalgia, and all these diseases.
But no one's saying support your liver, are they? Very few people talk about that. In fact, in the dialogue currently with, you know, keeping healthy, I haven't seen much about supporting your liver, apart from in the natural medicine community.
Yes.
We talk a lot about the proteins that clog up the brain and the heart. The amyloid in the brain, I believe, it's, as you said, it's meant to be a protection against oxidation. Is that right?
Yeah, it's I don't know if it's a protection, but it is, if it's not a protection, it is a damage due to the changes in pH and in acidity in the brain, which denaturates the proteins, which cannot function anymore, then create this amyloid, which is just there and nobody can use it. It just causes problems. And you would need your own heat shock proteins to break that down again. And the same is true for Parkinson's disease. That's the same thing, or everything that is related to prion, even the mad cow disease. Or I would also say that a lot of electromagnetic radiation would cause denaturation of proteins. And we probably need the ability of a heat shock response due to all the Wi-Fi's we have around us and all the mobile phones and more electromagnetic pollution, so to say. Or it's like living in a very low intensity microwave oven all the time. and we know what the microwave does to the proteins when we put it in. So it just becomes cooked, which is denaturation.
Yeah, so that's what's happening to us at a slower level.
That's what also happens to our proteins, yes, and we have to repair it.
Yeah, so we have to look at both reducing the toxic environment as much as we can and supporting our body to help clear the effects of that.
And then when we go back to the liver, why is the liver suffering?
Yeah.
Because of the gut.
Yes.
So that and then we have that. So it depends what we eat, when we eat. Is there stress? Because stress sets up digestion.
Yeah.
Very easily. You can eat healthy and you can live under a lot of stress. Your liver will suffer.
You're not absorbing. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And you create a fatty liver just by having stress.
Definitely.
And then the doctor may tell you, oh, you're just a fatty liver, you haven't eaten right, you drink too much alcohol, and you say, no.
Most people are living fairly high stress lives without even knowing it, to be fair.
Yeah.
Because of both current stresses, particularly the isolation, the lack of certainty that we have at the moment, but also longer term stresses of belief systems, conflicts, emotional problems, childhood events that weren't processed, attachment issues and so on. That's my specialism. So, but I think the message we want to bring over to people is there is something you can do, that there are many things you can do, and that you're not just waiting to see if you get either ill or the vaccine, that you can actually help support your body in a natural way that involves working in harmony rather than allowing your body to kind of degrade in the way that it is. So I think what we'll do is we'll publish the link in the description for the supplement that you.
Yeah, or we could do that, and I would recommend that all people who would like to research that way of how they could probably help themselves.
Yeah.
They may talk to their therapist about it. Yeah. And do some research together, maybe, because not many people know about it. It's a new field, and then it may be useful to complement other therapies with consuming a few of these heat shock proteins and give the body another option to heal itself.
Perfect. I mean, we talk about taking the blocks to healing away. That's how we work in natural medicine, isn't it? We don't just look at symptom suppression, which is what conventional medicine does. So so people can they could contact you, or they could contact me as well, and we'll put our details also in the description, because we're now working together in a sort of team collaboration, aren't we? Which will be under fatigue-free me, fatigue-free.me, which is our new team effort to try and bring together different modalities. So I'm going to be looking at stress and emotional healing. You're going to be doing much of the energetic and structural work. And then we've got nutritional therapy and myofascial therapy as well. So it's a very exciting time, I think, for people like you and I to be working, because we're looking at things in a totally different way to the current dialogue, which tells us that we're just passive victims. And so thank you so much for talking to me today. I've learned so much, and it's just brilliant to learn new things at this stage when you sort of think you know a lot about biology, but this is a totally new area for me. So
it was also for me. So I came across it about a year ago when I heard about it at the same time. So I did lots of article research and reading. And of course, the pharmaceutical industry is also working with heat shock proteins. So they are trying to develop some medications, and I know they are working with on inhibiting certain heat shock proteins, especially in cancer.
Cancer, yeah, I can see
So
the
they
advantage.
want to provide the cell with a substance that would inhibit the production of special heat shock proteins.
Yes.
But that there are so many, and they have such a general influence on our health, because this is a very old strategy for cells, which started billions of years ago. So the very first bacteria already had the ability to protect themselves with heat shock proteins. And during evolution, they haven't changed a lot. So the mechanism is still the same. So when there is any kind of damage coming from the outside, the cells stops the production of the structured proteins and produces other proteins which help to stabilize the function and the structure of the cell and keep it alive. So this is very, very exciting.
So it's been with us a long time, but we're only really recently getting to understand what's going on and hopefully be able to intervene and make positive changes. So brilliant. Well, obviously, thank you very much for talking with me today, and we're going to post this on all our available channels. But I'm sure if anybody has any questions, they can get in contact with either of us through the links that we'll post below. All right, well, thank you so much, and really good to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye.